You're listening to the Max Planck Lawcast, which showcases the academic research currently being conducted across the Max Planck Law Network. I'm your host, Christopher Murphy, and together we'll be talking to some of the more than 400 researchers who are pushing the frontiers of legal knowledge in Germany and abroad. When it comes to new and exciting legal research, the Lawcast has you covered. Well, welcome back to the Max Planck Lawcast. As always, it's wonderful to have you here with us today. Now, I'd have to say that one of the more memorable films that I caught in the early noughties was Minority Report. I believe it came out around 2002. Starring everyone's favourite maverick, Tom Cruise, Minority Report is all about a specialised police unit that has the ability to look into the future to apprehend criminals before they commit crimes. Of course, things don't go quite to plan, and the hunter soon becomes the hunted. It's a pretty cool mix of tech noir and science fiction thriller, and a film that is definitely worth seeing. Today's podcast also deals with the thorny issues concerning the role of artificial intelligence and predictive policing. It forms the second part of a series on artificial intelligence and crime, which was recorded on the sidelines of a conference held in March 2023 at the University of Buenos Aires. As Tom Cruise wasn't available to host the podcast, we instead have Christian Thönnes from the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Crime, Security and Law in Freiburg hosting the event. He is joined by Tatiana Tropina from the University of Leiden and Nandor Knust from the University of Tromsø. I hope you enjoy listening to the podcast.
Welcome, listeners, to the second part of our podcast series that we are recording from Buenos Aires, where we were at the International Colloquium on Predictive Policing and Predictive Justice by the IADP. In the second part of our podcast series, we will be talking about predictive policing. Predictive policing is a concept that is talked about quite often when we speak about automation of law and the use of artificial intelligence. And with the emergence of modern technologies, massive amounts of data can be sifted through and analyzed in order to predictively determine potential threats to public security. And I just had a discussion with Nandor Knust and Tatiana Tropina that ranged over a wide variety of topics, from the concept of predictive policing, how that interacts with more theoretical notions of social contracts, to more specific problems of the use of modern technologies for predictive policing, like algorithmic opacity and transparency, discrimination, and how these systems may perpetuate social inequalities. We also get a chance to talk about a new project that Nandor Knust is working on and to discuss which specific policy options policymakers may have when they think about how to use predictive policing, and how there are policy options that may be quite surprising and differing from the traditional terrorist detection framework that we know predictive policing for. So without further ado, let's delve into our discussion. I am joined today by Tatiana Tropina and by Nandor Knust. Tatiana Tropina is an assistant professor at Leiden University, and Nandor Knust is an associate professor at the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø. Thank you very much for joining me, Tatiana and Nandor. We're here today to talk about predictive policing and potential rule of law problems that may be associated with that. Tatiana, in your talk, you presented some of the concepts and problems potentially attached to predictive policing. First of all, to kind of get us up to speed, what does predictive policing mean to you?
Thank you very much for your question. So the idea of predictive policing is that we can somehow collect historical crime data. Let's say who committed this crime, what background they have, what kind of neighborhood they live in, and also some other information, like, let's say, private companies are now working on tools that will allow us to collect information about facial expression or body cues, and we can analyze this information to predict future crimes and future risks, either related to individuals or related to neighborhoods or particular group of people. So this is basically the idea. And if we talk about the use of AI tools in predictive policing, it means that this data is fed into algorithm, and algorithm is going to analyze it and take decision whether person or group or location is at a particular risk.
Now, predictive policing is a term that's been talked about for quite a while, but it's usually presented as something paradigm shifting. Police has responded to potential threats that occur in the future before, and they've used certain forms of technologies before in the past. So how would you say is predictive policing, at least as we understand it here, distinct from traditional forms of policing?
So let me put it like this. Traditional form of policing, as you mentioned, always try to keep this preventive function, patrolling the streets, let's say, or identifying individuals at risks, either victims or offenders. However, right now, the basic fundamental police function, like investigation of crimes that already happening or happened, has shifted to predicting crimes that will happen in the future. And of course, this also shifts the focus of administration of criminal justice, of how do we actually investigate crimes. So the idea is, let's predict crime before it happens because it solves the problem of investigation. And if you put AI element into all this, the idea that, well, first of all, AI will solve the problem of the lack of resources to predict and investigate crime. It will take tasks that humans cannot take. And secondly, there is this underlying notion or belief that police can be biased against people with certain background or certain skin color in certain areas. So the idea is somehow that technology is neutral and it can take unbiased decisions. Whether this is true or not, we can talk later, but this is another kind of attractiveness of this entire use of AI tools.
I would love to return to the problem of algorithmic discrimination and the neutrality or non-neutrality of these technologies. But I would like to quickly transition to you, Nandor. In your presentation, you outlined how predictive policing changes certain things within our societal contract, especially the new things, the new forms of policing that predictive policing entails. Could you maybe explain what changes predictive policing implies for the social contract?
Thank you for the question. Well, in modern societies, the right to use violence is transferred to the state, and social control as well as peace are maintained by law enforcement agencies as well as the criminal justice system, and in which or where decisions with severe consequences for the freedoms and the behavior of individuals are taken. So the integration of incomprehensible and increasingly autonomous algorithms into the law enforcement system or the criminal justice decision-making system causes an immense threat to the ideas of the social contract and the rule of law. So unlike crime forecasting approaches by human-machine interferences, guided methods, these new algorithms are capable to decide for themselves what and how they learn and choose. And this is a threat, because this makes them not only non-transparent or non-understandable for people without the necessary technical skills, but even create a black box for their developers due to their immense complexity in the decision-making process, such as deep learning. So when we discuss this then, the use of algorithmic forecasting software completely changed police and justice decision-making processes and the relationship of the police to the society or to the individual. So the characteristics of this new type of algorithm raises several questions about the role of artificial intelligence in social control, but also in changing normative expectations and as well the predictability of actions by the state.
Thank you very much, Nandor. I think you have already insinuated a problem that is very common in the discourse around predictive policing and the use of algorithms, which is opacity and the intransparency. Perhaps, Tatiana, as an expert on that, when we use algorithms for policing purposes, do we always really know what they do or what goes on inside these algorithms?
Well, I would say that for me it is a bit of a multidimensional question. I know that some of the developers and curators of the algorithms say that it is sometimes even a black box for them. But let's leave this situation aside. Let's say that the developers or the companies who are selling these AI tools to police know what is going on. The problem is that police, while using it, does not have enough expertise. Most of the police officers do not have enough expertise to understand what is going on, inside this black box. So the opacity and lack of understanding does not refer only to those who produce them and curate them, to those who might inadvertently produce this bias without knowing. Because, algorithms' decisions are only as good as data we feed them, right? But the lack of understanding in the police is yet another problem. So you might have one or two police officers who are highly educated, who might understand them, but in general, it's probably not the case because they were not educated as algorithm developers.
So let's say in a given police force, we have the biggest AI and algorithm experts you could possibly think of. Does that mean that all problems are solved? Are there any other hurdles usually to transparency of these algorithms?
No, one thing, because you alluded to the black box problem. Another thing is that transparency is not only about what algorithms are doing and their explainability. It is also about the lack of scrutiny. So, for example, if I am a company who is, let's say, developing an AI predictive tool, ideally, for the sake of transparency, I have to open all this development to independent researchers to look into what is going on, to double check, to provide some checks and balances. So one absolutely smart guy at the police force is probably not going to solve this problem. What this person, he or she, can do is to pinpoint some problems of the outputs, but they will not be able to solve the problem of the input and probably not the problem of the inherent bias of the algorithm.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Speaking about the intransparency of such systems, I remember, Nandor, in your talk, you talked about the importance of trust in legal relationships within the social contract. And what challenges does predictive policing create for trust?
Well, thank you. The problem is concerning trust is, for example, following the idea of foreseeability, understanding, as well as the concept of legitimation through procedure is that people need or want to understand how certain decisions are made. And even if those decisions are against, their will or their understanding of right and wrong, as long as they can understand them, how they are produced, they are much more willing to accept those things. And then using this and going back to what Tatiana just said about the black box, as long as I do not know how those kind of situations are produced, then normally I'm less willing to accept certain situations, or I want to challenge them because I simply cannot understand how they are produced. And I think, therefore, there is a certain importance, coming back to the idea what we're just talking about at the beginning of the social contract, and the idea is here the importance of human decisions and the human evaluation of situations, and therefore the acceptance of those kind of things. Maybe I can also put a question to you, Christian, because you talked about the importance of human interventions into predictive policing procedures. And maybe you can explain how your opinion is about human interventions and how important they are to generate legitimacy for predictive policing.
Well, thank you very much. As you know, Nandor, during my presentation, I talked about the PNR system, the directive on passenger name records, and how humans could intervene in this system. The PNR system is one of the paradigm examples of predictive policing in the European Union, and that directive prescribes for human to review automated hits of that system through non-automated means. And I think you have to distinguish between two levels of human intervention, and both of them are important, but I think it's important to make an analytic distinction. On the one hand, I think humans are important when it comes to the outcome of a certain decision, how accurate the results are, the prognoses are that a system creates. And for that purpose, I think humans have to make sure that they really know where to use these systems. For example, on the PNR system, they apply it to basically all flight passengers in the European Union. So within this gigantic mass of European flight passengers, they look for this tiny target variable of potential terrorists. And I think it would be a good form of human intervention to more critically think about whether it's a good idea to look for needles in a haystack and use the system in a more targeted way. But touching back on sort of the idea of a social contract, I think you can distinguish from this sort of output-oriented importance of human intervention a more fundamental aspect of why we want humans to be in the loop. I think it helps to engage in a thought experiment. Some of you may know the movie Minority Report. That's a system where crime can be predicted with almost 100% accuracy. So before we even know it, we could be put away for committing a crime in the future. And even if that was precise, I think we would have some problems with that, to put it lightly. We just expect as a fundamental concern, independently of the quality of outputs of a system, for a legal decision to be a human decision. And I think that goes back to similar ideas like the one you put forth, Nandor, about a social contract. In my PhD thesis, I work with recognition theory. And that fancy term, which relates back to social theory by Axel Honneth of the Frankfurt School, denotes the idea of a promise that we give each other, similar to the idea of a social contract, where we promise each other to treat each other like moral subjects capable of self-determination. And I think when you delegate to machines the indiscriminate surveillance and analysis of people in predictive policing mechanisms, you kind of cut against this promise, because you don't treat individuals anymore like capable of moral subjects, capable of self-determining their life, but you say their past determines their future. And you delegate a huge part of the decision to a machine. In a way, as you both emphasize the intransparency of some of these systems, in a way that makes it sometimes impossible for humans to engage with these results in any meaningful sort of way. So I was really fascinated to hear about the idea of a social contract, Nandor, and I think there remains much more academic work to be done, how sort of the relationships of mutual recognition and the contractual idea behind what the state should do can be upheld while still using the benefits of these systems. But speaking about differences between how humans and machines make decisions, maybe a superficial idea people may have when they ask themselves if computers or algorithms should make decisions, they think, well, we humans are biased in all sorts of ways, right? We're racist, we're sexist, and so forth. Computers, at least it seems, are not. But I remember you saying, Tatiana, in your presentations that computers aren't neutral. In which way are they not neutral?
Thank you. So, this just the entire idea about technology being neutral. We always forget that technology and algorithms are created by people. But this wasn't the main point in my presentation. So this is the underlying notion. If anybody believes that technology is neutral, it's not. It's created by humans. But let me move to predictive policing. So algorithms, if you remember my first answer to the first question, decisions by algorithms are based on data about crime and other data, right? So we give this data into algorithm. Data can be incomplete because not all crime is recorded. Let's say some neighborhoods are policed more than others, so more crime is observed. People with different social backgrounds are already treated by police differently. All this data is going into AI tools. And here AI is neutral. For one reason, it cannot determine what is right and what is wrong. Which information is good, which is bad, it just processes it all. And based on this incomplete data, which already contains the pattern of discrimination, because this data is created by people, it's created by previous convictions, it's created by previous prejudices. And then we have decisions that just exacerbate these discriminatory principles. And then we have this data. We police again the same neighborhood, the same people, police arrest them, data goes back. So bad data reproduces more bad data, and here the circle, perpetuates.
The circle perpetuates. I remember you saying a sentence that resonated quite strongly with me during your presentation. You said, with predictive policing, people are essentially punished for who they are. Does that relate to this idea?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Let me start with this underlying idea that police is biased, technology is neutral. So we somehow accept that police is biased. And perhaps we even know where the bias lies. The bias lies in disadvantaged backgrounds, different color skin, neighborhood where people live in, education, social status, work status, migration status. Many of these characteristics people do not create themselves. like kids do not choose where they were born or where to be born. So predictive policing puts a heavy burden exactly on these neighborhoods, on these disadvantaged groups, because of the data which is already biased. So algorithms are reproducing these patterns of discrimination, like widening the gap between privilege and the absence of privilege, between I have and I have not. So basically it stigmatizes those who are already stigmatized.
Thank you very much. For the last section, I kind of want to make another transition into specific conceivable use cases for predictive policing. And I think it's quite interesting to have someone here with you, Nandor, who tries to work with the concept in unique ways that are not really identical with what we usually think of when we think of predictive policing. What we usually think of is trying to find terrorists or violent criminals within a general mass population. But in Tromsø, you're working on a project, EcoCrim, that you had the chance to briefly talk about here in Buenos Aires. Maybe you could introduce us to that project.
Well, this project is more or less a follow-up project on a project that was the reason that I moved to Tromsø, which was called Fiskekrim. Fiske means fish in Norwegian, and which was on transnational fishery crimes and the use of new technology to combat those crimes. The main idea is to use the concepts of policing or law enforcement in different forums. So here, concerning eco-crime, we try to look. Well, first of all, we look at massive environmental crimes, which are mainly in combination with large-scale corruption, and they have a huge destructive impact on ecosystems and the climate in general, and undermines the rights of community, local population, indigenous peoples, and so on. And by the use of new technologies like satellite images, like deep learning mechanisms, artificial intelligence, sensors, cameras, and so on. The idea is to combat those crimes, to look at unreported and unregulated fishing, illegal mining, waste trafficking, climate and pollution crimes, and so on. I'm in a very lucky position that I have the possibility, under the guidance of Professor Dag Johansen, Harvard Johansen, as well as Jon Peter Rui, together to have a research group which is just focusing on this, focusing on new technologies to combat transnational criminality. And we expand this here in Tromsø with other disciplines like biology, sociology, geology, political science, and to create some sort of a network of scholars who are dealing with this to overcome the fragmentation of the different disciplines and to work together about a system to monitor and to investigate as well as prosecute those kind of crimes.
I remember, Nandor, in your theoretical framework, you talked about trust. And now you introduce a technology into the system. Has this raised issues with trust? And how do you think could you remedy those problems?
Mostly the discussion or the academic discussion about trust in AI or new technologies is always that there's a distrust about technologies. And we are currently looking at it from a different perspective. If you can use new technologies or procedures or mechanisms which are based on technology to overcome a certain mistrust concerning humans or human institutions. So if there's a mistrust, for example, against law enforcement agencies, if there's a mistrust against other companies, this is mainly focusing on the exchange of data, for example. As long there is a procedure which is run by a machine, that this is maybe more trustworthy than a human that might intervene or taking this kind of information you transferred for his own benefit.
Thank you very much, Nandor, for giving us some insight into this exciting new project. I'll be looking forward to see how you will be able to give a human face and to establish trust for this, I think, system that can create a lot of social benefits. But as we are already on the policy level, Tatiana, since you also talked about policy options that policymakers could have when they think about predictive policing systems, what considerations do you think are important? What policy options are there?
Thank you. And to me, this is a very interesting question, because if we put it in the context of the rule of law, there is also an option. The first starting ground zero option is to do nothing in terms of creating some new regulation. The rule of law is already here. Privacy is already here. Just reinforce it. But I think that that's what policymakers have been sort of struggling with. Because technology is extremely complex, technology is opaque. Technology and creation of algorithms involved a complex system of public and private actors designing, curating, and using it. So I think that do nothing is not an option anymore. And what I see right now ranges from some sort of general overall commitment of reinforcement of rule of law, which is put in the context of artificial intelligence. For example, the Council of Europe currently is working on the Convention on Artificial Intelligence, Human Rights, Democracy, and the Rule of Law. So if any of the listeners are interested, you can look at the zero draft, because zero draft has been produced and put out for comments. And what we see that a proposed convention just outlines some general principles, let's say fundamental principles of design of artificial intelligence. And then there is equality and non-discrimination, accountability, transparency, and oversight. They talk about commitments, but they do not say exactly what kind of regulation should be put in place. Just states commit and just go and do your thing. This is the general approach. Just let's say commit to human rights in declaration and covenants and then kind of enforce them. Another option is regulate specific technologies and their use. Let's say, let's regulate predictive policing technologies. So let's regulate this particular type of algorithms. And we can also regulate specific technologies and then ban others. That's also an option. That's the harder option. And the option that looked like last resort for a long time, but that is coming into discussions, is just ban AI tools and predictive policing. And if I may elaborate on the last one a tad more. So you might be aware, and if you are not aware, I'm going to tell you. So the EU put forward a proposal for AI regulation. And in that proposal, European Commission actually reflected that social scoring systems are dangerous. So they have to be banned. Then it proposed to ban biometric surveillance by law enforcement. But I mean, exceptions are narrow, but if you look how narrow they are, they're actually quite wide. European Parliament proposed amendments that are basically sending the message, this is not enough. You should ban predictive policing tools explicitly in addition to social scoring system. Knowing how regulation is developed in the EU, how is negotiated, I think there would be some middle ground in between these two. Perhaps a bit more regulation, perhaps designation as a high risk, perhaps some additional requirements. We don't know yet. So this is a work in progress. But it would be interesting to see how these two efforts of Council of Europe and the European Union go in parallel and whether they are going to complement each other, contradict each other, because people who are participating in this drafting, I mean, the groups of people might overlap. So I'm curious to see how it will end. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this insight into potential regulatory strategies. As someone who's been working on these systems that are used in the Schengen context, like PNR, ETIAS, the visa system, I was also disappointed to see that at least in the Commission's draft, there was an exception for the systems that are already in use in ETIAS and PNR that are in use in the Schengen context, which to my mind would kind of exclude some of the systems from the draft act scope where regulation would be the most important. So it'll be exciting to see how that progresses. Well, you already see, listeners, we could continue talking for hours, I think, but we are going to conclude here. Dear Tatiana, dear Nando, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you very much for listening to today's episode. A big thank you to Christian for conducting the discussion with Tatiana and Nandor. I don't think Tom Cruise could have done it any better. If you haven't listened to part 1 of the series on artificial intelligence and crime, please go ahead and do so. If you have, then be sure to stay tuned to the Lawcast for more episodes from across the Max Planck Law Network. From Buenos Aires to Berlin, the Lawcast has you covered. Thanks for listening to the Lawcast. If you'd like more information about Max Planck Law, or if you'd like to get involved, please visit us at law.mpg.de.
Max Planck Law. Excellence in legal research.